A stoic, solitary rancher, his soul etched with the barbed wire of a shame he carried like a shroud, rode into the teeth of a sun-scorched settlement and there, before a jeering, merciless crowd, impulsively claimed a terrorized, caged woman, offered up for the price of cast-off chattel, not as property, but with a voice raw with an ancient, unspoken vow, as his wife, thereby forging in the crucible of societal contempt a perilous path toward shared silence, the slow, fragile bloom of trust, and a redemption paid in scars and whispered truths under the vast, uncaring sky. The dust of the makeshift auction ground rose in choking clouds, each particle a tiny testament to the desolation that clung to this raw edge of the frontier. It settled on the sweat-slicked faces of the men gathered, their eyes glinting with a predatory hunger that had little to do with wholesome appetite. Before them, on a crudely constructed platform of weathered planks, stood a cage, more suited to a wild animal than a human being. And within it, Ilara. Her dress was torn, her face smudged with dirt and the faint, bruised shadow of violence, but her spine, though bowed by exhaustion and despair, held a core of unyielding iron. She expected nothing. $5, perhaps. The price of a broken tool, a lame horse. The thought, a bitter bile in her throat, did not make her flinch, only retreat further into the stony fortress of her mind where no further degradation could truly touch the essence of who she had once been. The auctioneer, a corpulent man with a voice like oiled gravel and eyes that stripped away dignity layer by painful layer, gestured towards her with a flourish. "Gentlemen, what am I bid for this a prime piece?" His laughter was a wet, ugly sound that caught in the shimmering heat. A few ragged cheers, a low, guttural bid. $5, someone shouted, and the sum hung in the air, a final insult. On the fringes of the crowd, leaning against a sun-bleached hitching post, Silas watched. His face, weathered as an old saddle, gave away nothing of the storm that raged within him. He was a man acquainted with ghosts, his own past a relentless spectre that rode with him, slept with him, whispered accusations in the lonely quiet of his remote ranch. He had come to town for salt and nails, not for a spectacle of human cruelty. Yet his gaze was snared by the woman in the cage. He saw not the dirt, nor the fear that vibrated almost visibly around her, but a flicker in her downcast eyes, a resilience that mirrored the stubborn, hard-scrabble life he himself clung to. It was a kinship of shadows, an unspoken understanding of pain. He saw the way her hands, though tied, were curled into fists, not in aggression, but in a desperate, silent clenching against the inevitable. And something within him, a core of decency he thought long dead and buried under layers of regret and isolation, snapped. The auctioneer was starting to cajole. $5 it is. Going once. Silas straightened, the movement economical, almost imperceptible, yet it drew a few curious glances. His voice, when it came, was not loud, but it cut through the murmuring and the heat like a blade of cold steel. "She's my wife." A stunned silence fell, thick and heavy as a woolen blanket in summer. Even the cicadas seemed to pause their incessant chorus. Ilara's head jerked up, her eyes, wide and disbelieving, locking with his for a fleeting, incomprehensible second. The auctioneer sputtered, his face purpling. "Wife? What nonsense is this, drifter? She's for sale." Other men began to grumble, a low, menacing sound. Silas didn't move, didn't flinch. His hand went to the worn leather pouch at his belt. "How much do you say your words?" he asked, his tone flat, his eyes never leaving the auctioneer's. There was a dangerous stillness about him, the quiet of a coiled rattlesnake. The auctioneer, though blustering, saw something in that gaze that gave him pause. This was not a man to be trifled with lightly. Greed, however, warred with caution. $50, he blustered, naming a sum he thought impossible for such a ragged figure. To compensate for the misunderstanding. And my troubles without a word, Silas counted out the coins, worn silver and dull copper, into the man's sweaty palm. The amount was nearly all he had, the fruit of months of brutal, solitary labor. He watched it go until the last ember of his savings disappeared. Then, he walked towards the cage. The crowd parted uneasily before him. He didn't look at Ilara, not yet. He addressed the man fumbling with the cage's crude latch. "Open it," the latch rasped, the door creaked open. Silas held out a hand, not to grab, but as an offering. His voice was low, for her ears alone, rough but strangely devoid of threat. Come. Ilara stared at his outstretched hand, calloused and stark against the grim backdrop. It was a lifeline thrown into an ocean of despair, yet it could just as easily be another chain. But the alternative was unthinkable. Slowly, hesitantly, she rose, her limbs stiff, her heart a wild bird against her ribs. She did not take his hand, but she stepped out of the cage, into the suffocating silence of a future she could not fathom, beside a man whose name she did not know. The journey from that sun-blasted purgatory to Silas's ranch was a passage carved from silence and dust. The trail wound upwards, away from the sparse pretense of civilization, into a landscape that was starkly beautiful and brutally indifferent. Jagged peaks clawed at the relentless blue sky, their slopes clothed in a sparse, hardy green that spoke of survival against all odds. Silas rode ahead, his back a rigid line against the horizon, Ilara following on the tired nag he'd acquired with the last of the auctioneer's exorbitant fee. He hadn't forced her, he'd simply untied the mare's reins from the post where she'd been left, gestured, and waited. The choice, such as it was, had been hers: follow this stranger into the unknown, or remain to face the certain horrors of the town. He offered her water from his canteen regularly, the gesture brief, impersonal, yet essential. When the sun began to dip, painting the rocks in hues of blood orange and bruised purple, he dismounted, built a small, smokeless fire, and shared his meager rations of dried meat and hardtack. He laid out a worn bedroll for her a respectful distance away, his own blanket serving him near the dying embers. He spoke little, his words as sparse as the vegetation around them. Eat, rest, and once, when she stumbled on a loose rock, his hand shot out, steadying her arm for a moment before retreating as if burned. Careful. Ilara watched him. Every movement, every flicker of expression on his guarded face was catalogued, analyzed. Her fear was a living thing, a cold knot in her belly, but beneath it, a desperate curiosity stirred. This man was an enigma. He had paid a small fortune for her, called her his wife, a lie so audacious it still made her head spin, and yet, he treated her with a strange, almost formal detachment. There was no leering in his eyes, no predatory anticipation in his touch, which he seemed to avoid at all costs. His silence was a heavy cloak, but it was not the menacing silence of her captors. It was something deeper, something rooted in a sorrow that resonated with her own unspoken grief. She remained mute, her voice locked away with the memory she fought to suppress. Silence had been her only armor for so long, she did not know how to shed it, especially not now, in the presence of this man who was both her rescuer and, potentially, another kind of jailer. His ranch, when they finally reached it after 2 days of hard travel, was little more than a testament to human tenacity against an unforgiving wilderness. A small, roughly hewn log cabin stood in a meager clearing, its windows like vacant eyes staring out at the vast emptiness. A lean-to stable, a patched corral, and a few struggling rows of what might one day be vegetables completed the picture of stark self-sufficiency. It was a place of profound loneliness, the kind that seeped into your bones and chilled you from the inside out. Silas gestured towards the cabin. Yours, he said, the single word hanging in the thin air. I'll take the stable. He unstrapped her meager bundle from the saddle, a bundle containing nothing but the rags on her back and the invisible weight of her trauma. He placed it just inside the cabin door. You are safe here, he stated, his gaze meeting hers briefly, intensely. Then, as if remembering a vital promise, he added, his voice raspy, I won't hurt you. The words, simple and direct, were a stark contrast to the violence she had known. She didn't believe them, not entirely, but a tiny, exhausted part of her desperately wanted to. That first night, she lay on the crude cot inside the cabin, the door barred with a piece of wood she'd found, listening to the sounds of the wilderness and the occasional restless stirrings of Silas in the nearby stable. Sleep was a shallow, troubled thing, but for the first time in what felt like an eternity, she was not in a cage. The next morning, he left a pail of fresh water and a portion of cooked cornmeal outside her door before heading out to work the unyielding land. When he returned at dusk, weary and caked in dust, he found she had eaten, and that a broken stool near the hearth had been carefully, if inexpertly, propped against the wall. He said nothing, but he noticed. And in the silent communion of that shared, desolate space, something almost imperceptible began to shift, like the first thaw after a long, brutal winter. Days bled into weeks, each one a repetition of the last, etched in the rhythms of sunup and sundown, hunger and labor. Silas toiled from dawn till dusk, his movements economical and purposeful, coaxing a reluctant existence from the unforgiving soil, mending fences that seemed to lean in weariness, tending to the few hardy animals that constituted his worldly wealth. Ilara watched him from the shadowed doorway of the cabin, or from the crude bench he had fashioned for her beneath the solitary, wind-twisted pine that stood sentinel over their isolated domain. Her silence remained largely unbroken, a fortress around her still tender wounds, but her eyes were no longer dull with despair. They were watchful, assessing, absorbing the quiet cadence of this strange, new life. She began to venture out, small excursions at first, to the creek for water, to gather firewood. She swept the cabin floor with a makeshift broom of twigs, washed their meager dishes in the tin basin, small acts of domesticity that were less about servitude and more about reclaiming a sliver of agency in a world that had stripped her of everything. Silas never commanded, never instructed. He simply left the tools of survival where she might find them, acknowledging her efforts with a slight, almost imperceptible nod, or by ensuring there was always enough wood chopped for her small fire. The necessity of supplies eventually forced them from their isolated sanctuary. The journey to the settlement was a tense, unspoken dread between them. Silas's jaw was set, his eye scanning the trail with a vigilance that spoke of anticipated trouble. Ilara, riding the placid mare, felt the old fear rise, cold and sharp, but this time it was mingled with a new, unwelcome anxiety for the man who rode beside her, this silent protector whose motives remained shrouded in mystery. As they entered the dusty main street, the familiar chorus of hostile stares and hushed, venomous whispers greeted them. Men lounging outside the saloon fell silent, their eyes, cold and appraising, fixing on Ilara, then flicking with contempt toward Silas. The auctioneer, still smarting from the public challenge to his authority and the loss of a profitable transaction, stood before the general store, his bulk blocking the entrance, a smirk playing on his lips. "Well, well," he sneered, his voice carrying easily in the still air. "If it ain't the loving couple. Still playing house with your $5 acquisition rancher." His cronies snickered. Silas reined in his horse, his face impassive, but Ilara saw the muscle jump in his jaw, the whitening of his knuckles on the reins. He didn't rise to the bait. "Need supplies," he said, his voice flat, his gaze fixed on a point just past the auctioneer's shoulder. He dismounted, his movements deliberate, and helped Ilara down, his touch brief and impersonal on her arm, yet undeniably protective. Inside the dim, cluttered mercantile, the air was thick with unspoken judgment. But here, a small, unexpected crack of light appeared in the oppressive gloom. The proprietor, a wiry old man named Jedediah, with kind eyes crinkled at the corners, nodded curtly to Silas and then, to Ilara's surprise, offered her a hesitant, shy smile. He said, his voice quiet but respectful. As Silas listed his needs, flour, salt, coffee, a few precious bullets, Jedediah filled the order efficiently, his gaze occasionally drifting to Ilara with a sort of gentle curiosity rather than malice. When Silas paid, the old man pressed a small, withered apple into Ilara's hand. "For the lady," he murmured, his eyes conveying a sympathy that warmed a tiny, frozen corner of her heart. "Thank you," she whispered, the words rusty from disuse, barely audible. It was the first voluntary sound she had made to a stranger in months. The auctioneer and his cohorts were still loitering outside when they emerged, but Silas, his supplies secured, simply mounted and, with a curt nod to Jedediah, led the way out of town, leaving the taunts to fade behind them. Back at the ranch, the silence that fell between them was different, less fraught with suspicion, more imbued with a shared experience, a small victory against the ugliness of the world. That evening, as Silas mended a piece of tack by the light of the fire, Ilara, after a long internal debate, quietly took the worn shirt he had discarded, threaded a needle she'd found in a forgotten tin, and began to mend a tear in the sleeve. He watched her hands, surprisingly deft despite their trembling, and a look flickered across his face, something too complex to name, but it held no threat, only a profound, weary understanding. He did not speak of his past, not yet, but sometimes, when he thought she wasn't looking, he would trace the outline of a faded daguerreotype he kept tucked inside his worn leather vest, his expression one of infinite, silent sorrow. The fragile piece they had begun to cultivate was as delicate as a desert bloom, vulnerable to the first harsh wind. And the wind came, not as a natural storm, but in the guise of human malice, carried on the bitter currents of resentment and greed. The auctioneer, his pride still festering, had brooded. He'd convinced himself, and a few of his more brutish companions, that Silas, the quiet outcast, must have some hidden wealth, some reason for paying such a sum for a ruined woman. Or perhaps it was simply the base desire to exert power, to shatter the defiant serenity Silas and Elara had dared to build on the fringes of their cruel world. They came under the cloak of a moonless night, the air thick with the promise of rain, their approach heralded by the nervous whicker of Silas's horse. He was awake instantly, moving from his bedroll in the stable with the lethal silence of a man long accustomed to danger. He saw the flickering torchlight through the gaps in the stable wall, heard the low, drunken voices. "Silas! We know you're in there, hiding with your precious whore. We've come for what's ours." The auctioneer's voice, slurred but venomous. Silas grabbed his old rifle, his mind racing. He glanced towards the cabin, where a sliver of candlelight showed beneath the door. Elara! He had to protect her. He stepped out into the oppressive darkness, a stark silhouette against the stable mouth. "Leave," he said, his voice a low growl that carried the weight of deadly intent. "She's under my protection." "There's nothing for you here." Laughter, ugly and sharp, answered him. "We'll be the judge of that, sodbuster." A shot rang out, splintering the wood beside his head. The fight was upon them, brutal and desperate. Silas fired back, using the meager cover of the corral posts. He was one man against four, but he fought with the ferocity of someone defending not just his life, or Elara's, but the last vestige of his own reclaimed humanity. Inside the cabin, Elara heard the gunshots, the shouts. Terror, cold and paralyzing, threatened to engulf her. But then, through the fear, another emotion surged, a fierce, unexpected anger. This was her sanctuary, however fragile, and that man out there, that silent, tormented man, was fighting for her. She would not cower. She would not be a victim again. Her eyes darted around the small space. A heavy iron poker lay by the cold hearth. She grabbed it, its weight surprisingly reassuring in her trembling hands. The cabin door creaked open. One of the attackers, thinking to flank Silas, was silhouetted against the dark sky. Before he could react, before Silas could even see the new threat, Elara screamed, a raw, primal sound of fury and warning, and lunged, swinging the poker with all her strength. It connected with the man's arm with a sickening thud. He howled in pain and surprise, stumbling back. Her action created a crucial diversion. Silas, momentarily freed from one attacker, whirled and disabled another. The fight raged, a chaotic dance of shadows and muzzle flashes. Silas took a bullet to the shoulder, staggering, but he stayed on his feet, his jaw clenched against the searing pain. Elara, seeing him falter, rushed from the cabin, heedless of her own safety, the poker still clutched in her hand. She stood beside him, a small, fierce figure, her eyes blazing. The remaining attackers, seeing their odds diminish, their leader now nursing a broken arm thanks to a mere woman, and unnerved by the combined, desperate fury of their intended victims, lost their nerve. With curses and threats of return, they melted back into the darkness from which they'd come. The immediate aftermath was a deafening silence, broken only by Silas's ragged breathing and the distant rumble of the approaching storm. He sank to his knees, the rifle clattering to the ground. Elara was beside him instantly, her hands, surprisingly gentle, probing the bloody wound in his shoulder. Their eyes met, and in that gaze, stripped bare by violence and shared peril, a profound, unspoken understanding flowed between them. The silence now was not one of fear or uncertainty, but of a bond forged in fire, a testament to their shared survival. The storm broke then, unleashing a torrent of rain that washed the blood from the dusty ground and mirrored the tempest of emotions that had been unleashed. Inside the small cabin, lit by a single flickering candle, Elara tended to Silas's wound. Her touch, once hesitant and fearful, was now steady, surprisingly skillful as she cleaned the injury with boiled water and a strip of her own petticoat. He watched her, his face pale and etched with pain, but his eyes held a new softness, a vulnerability she had never seen before. Words were still scarce, but they were no longer essential. The shared ordeal had stripped away the layers of distrust and isolation, revealing the raw, aching humanity beneath. As she bound his shoulder, her fingers brushed his skin, and a current, potent and unexpected, passed between them. It was not the fire of lust, but the warm ember of a deeper connection, kindled in the ashes of shared suffering and nascent respect. He leaned his head back against the rough wall, his breath catching. "Thank you," he rasped, the words costing him. She merely nodded, her own throat tight with unshed tears, not of sorrow, but of a fierce, protective tenderness. Days turned into weeks of slow healing, both for Silas's physical wound and for the deeper lacerations on their souls. Ilara became his nurse, his shadow, her presence a constant, quiet reassurance. She coaxed him to eat the broth she made, changed his dressings with a gentle efficiency, and sat with him through the long nights when fever claimed him. And slowly, haltingly, they began to talk. Not of grand philosophies or elaborate histories, but of small things, fragments of memory, whispered confessions in the dim light. He spoke of the shame that had driven him to this isolated existence, a tragic accident years ago, a moment of perceived failure that had branded him a coward in his own eyes, a failure to protect those he loved. She, in turn, offered glimpses of her own fractured past, the loss, the brutality, the slow erosion of hope before his desperate, unbelievable claim at that horrific auction. Their words were like tentative bridges built across a chasm of pain, each syllable a stone laid with care. The ranch, once a symbol of Silas's profound loneliness, began to transform. With Ilara's help, as he regained his strength, they repaired the damage from the attack. She planted a small herb garden near the cabin door, its tiny green shoots a defiant promise of life. He mended the broken stool properly, carved a crude but recognizable bird for her from a piece of scrap wood. The silence between them was now companionable, punctuated by shared tasks, quiet meals, and the occasional, rare sound of Ilara's soft laughter, a sound that Silas found himself anticipating with an unfamiliar ache in his chest. The threat from the town seemed to recede, the defeated men did not return, perhaps deterred by their injuries, or perhaps Jedediah, the kind shopkeeper, had quietly spoken to the circuit judge about the unprovoked attack. A quiet, profound love began to bloom, unspoken but deeply felt, nurtured in the harsh soil of their shared experience. It was in the way he watched her tend her garden, the way she instinctively knew when his shoulder pained him, the way their hands sometimes brushed during their work, sending a jolt of quiet electricity through them. One evening, as the sun bled crimson across the vast sky, Silas took a small, smooth stone he had carried for years and, with his knife, carefully carved her initial, E, beside his own S on the weathered lintel of the cabin door. He said nothing, but when she saw it the next morning, her eyes filled, and she touched the carvings with a reverence that spoke volumes. The past was not erased, its scars remained, but it no longer held them captive. They had found not just survival, but a fragile, precious peace, a home built not of logs and mud, but of forgiveness, acceptance, and the enduring strength of two broken souls mending together. This, then, is their story. A testament that even in the deepest shadow, a single act of courage, a refusal to let the cruelty of the world extinguish the last ember of compassion, can ignite a beacon of hope. It speaks of redemption, not as a grand absolution, but as the quiet, daily choice to be better, to protect, to cherish. It whispers of resilience, the unbreakable spirit that can endure the unimaginable and still find the strength to trust, to love, to rebuild. They were two solitary figures, thrown together by fate's cruel hand, who found in each other's damaged reflections a reason to fight, a reason to heal, and ultimately, a reason to live. Theirs is a love story written not in sonnets, but in shared silence, mended wounds, and the courageous embrace of a future they chose to build together, against all odds. Remember their journey. Remember that even in the harshest wilderness, kindness can take root, and love can, and will, find a way. If their story has touched your heart, if you believe in the power of the human spirit to overcome, then subscribe now. Hit that bell so you don't miss a single tale of courage and connection. Join our campfire and let these stories remind you that hope is never truly lost.